if we were to return to a gatherer, hunter, or primitivist way of living as you suggest, where do you see settlers fitting into that equation? Would non-indigenous people continue to live here on these lands, but live as gatherer hunters, or?
Well, I would guess, or maybe just hope, that if there's some kind of radical change in the ethos, there could be a connection between Eurocentric the settlers and the people that have lived here, the original people. I mean, there's no basis of trust or any kind of or anything otherwise. It seems to me. I mean, you know, and even in the very language, if we're talking about honoring the indigenous dimension, it's not really about standards of living, is it? I mean, I brought in Marshall Solins last night about when he was making the point that if your needs are met, you're not poor, and if your needs aren't met, even if you own all kinds of stuff, you're not rich. And he was putting the, you know, kind of somewhat classic hunter-gatherer figure, or forager figure, or whatever you want to call it, in this competition with the present economic world, with capitalism. And so I guess what I'm getting at is that the way we measure things? Wouldn't that be part of the shift? It's not how much money people are making. I mean, that's almost the problem. And maybe that's why the hateful guy out there picketing doesn't like me or primitivists, but, you know, ultimately it goes that way. Do we measure things by just how much money people are making? I mean, that's you're not going to go anywhere with that. And is that what satisfies people? Everybody knows it isn't. Everybody knows consumer society is empty and bereft. And I mean, I'd like to think that, and I'm glad you know your neighbors. I'm glad, I mean, the question of community, you know, it's defined in different ways. I mean, I think, I mean, I define it more in terms of some kind of accountability or responsibility in a face-to-face way, which you do not have in mass society very much. And when it is there, it's worth a lot, and it's worth fighting for and enlarging that scope of it wherever it is. For example, in the, you know, if you're living in a co-op or whatever it might be. But, you know, the main thing, the key things are not done in terms of responsibility for each other. They're just not. It doesn't work that way. And in fact, for example, people who say, as anarchists, and I do too, get rid of the cops. Well, you're not going to get rid of the cops until there's community. I mean, and that's a connection to indigenous reality too, I think. You can raise that, but it ain't going to happen when people really don't have anything else except to call some authority or some expert of one kind or another. I mean, I don't see that as community. There's no autonomy. There's actually no responsibility for each other. I mean, there's not none. I mean, we try to help each other. That's so important. But the general movement is for less and less of it. The general movement is for more and more isolation and more anxiety and more depression and more separation, more people living alone. I mean, fewer friends. I mean, there's all these studies. It's not pretty. And so I don't get how just changing the shape of cities is really going to do much of anything. These are much deeper problems. And so I think that does connect with the question of relationship to the original, the people who had a connection with the earth. How do we get to a connection with the earth, to reconnect with the earth? How do we change from domination of nature, which is another, I mean, domestication, that's just another word for that, to something else? Totally hard. But if we don't make that effort, I think we're just sailing along to the big old waterfall. And I agree, however, though, let me just say, I really agree with Matt about the collapse thing. It can be soothing. There's almost an enchantment. Oh, you know, the big thing is going to happen, the big dramatic, you know, and then it's all over. Well, no, probably not. I agree with you. It's going to be a degradation. Things will get worse, and it won't solve the problems. If anybody, like the one person who last night brought up the question of power relations, oppression in terms of, for example, sexism, racism, homophobia. How would that just go away if there's a collapse? I mean, obviously, And so Derek's point, I think, is instructive. I don't really know how far Derek Jensen really thinks there can be a soft landing. I don't know if he does or not, actually, but that's worth working for. That if we are the conscious agents of pulling it down and stopping it and having something totally different on totally different foundations, I mean, I think we got to go for that. We might fail, but otherwise, I don't see any real prospects. I'd like to see past my lifetime and that there could be people taking that direction, even forced to take that direction, not just because of possible economic collapse, but just the collapse of the soul. You know, when I see, we didn't clearly the pathologies of modern urban life didn't exist when there were indigenous communities. I'm not saying, I mean, no one's saying it's a perfect Eden any time and place you look at it. I'm not making that point, but, you know, how much have we lost?
Hey Matt, the next one I have for you, where do indigenous communities who are living their traditional ways on the lands that they have always lived on, living with the land, lived on, where do these communities fit into your idea of radical urbanism?
Yeah. Well, let me just say just a tiny thing if you can do. So I think what I'm arguing here for, though, is not just simple reconfiguration of cities, right? That a reconfiguration of cities can happen in any context, right? It can happen in in any context. I'm talking about an explicit anti-capitalist reconfiguration of cities, right? So just if I can nuance my position in your retelling just a little bit, that would be great. But simply, like, I mean, that in fact, I made all kinds of developers. In fact, there's all kinds of developers in my life who are thrilled with the idea of densification because it means the densification of their profits. So, I mean that's sincerely, right? So, I mean, much of this, right, is we have to nuance and think about it carefully, right? So, simple just urbanization or living compactly or living to share have to go hand in hand with an explicitly anti-capitalist, something that I would call an anarchist commitment to mutual aid, to confederalism, to neighborhood, to local control, to a whole raft of things that are involved around local participation and direct control of local control of decision making in particular. And I guess I hasten to say as well that I think this is I'm restating what I said earlier, is that my personal kind of thing around indigenous governance is that our goal should be to return as much land as humanly possible to those who have a rightful claim to it. And that's about it. That's about it. And after that, I don't have much to say. Yeah, you know, and that for example, the claims that you know, the unbelievably painful and intense and degrading claim process, for example, with the Swazi First Nation that they were forced to go through, is just brutal, right? And so the traditional land that they occupied was, you know, what they ended up with was they ended up coming with the Native Affairs. Or just this unbelievably pathetic, tiny little sliver of land that they end up left with, compared to what they deserve and asked for originally, and, you know, rightfully demanded. So after that process, and I think in particular and I'm not particular around here, I would say that's our first and foremost as anarchists or whatever y'all want to call yourselves. I can't think of any other exigency that trumps indigenous rights. But those rights have to occur within a context of returning land, of acknowledging land claims, acknowledging traditional territories, and returning as much humanly possible. So after that, I don't got much to say about what the hell they're doing.
Hey, John, in your article, The Left, No Thanks, you said that gatherer-hunter life, also known as band society, was the original and only anarchy, face-to-face community in which people took responsibility for themselves and each other, end quote. But on much of the coast of BC, as well as other places, many indigenous peoples had permanent villages. One element of colonialism is that those of the dominant society impose a impose their way of living upon, or their understanding of how things are upon indigenous peoples, rather than allowing them to determine for themselves how they should live. Isn't saying that gather-hunter society is the only anarchy doing that?
Or imposing something? Well, yeah, if it was imposed on anyone, that would be a dreadful idea. Of course, indigenous people living right now, obviously don't live in a vacuum. And it goes without saying that their rights should be respected and their lands should be restored, but they live in a globalized world. We got to face that. I mean, that's the starting point. But then what? What are they forced to do to live in this world? I mean, in some cases, clear cuts and so forth. I mean, they're under these pressures. They don't get to be apart from it. That's the first problem. You can try to destroy the lifeways and the institutions of people, and that's been obviously the intent and the record. I don't know if it's worse here or worse in the States. I'm not sure about that, but it can't be an imposition. But I mean, and when these things come to pass, for example, people practice domestication before contact. I'm not a big expert on North American ways of Native peoples, but yeah, it's not all. These are kind of fundamental things, and whether people are. I mean, people have all kinds of opinions. You can talk to Native folks about casinos. Some hate that. Some love it. They see that as the only opportunity they have, or any kind of variation of opinions. And the choice. But again, the choice isn't made just in some vacuum. They have to obey the capitalist forces and everything too. So it can't be too abstract about it. You have to be historical about it and realize the context. And that applies to all kinds of efforts that sometimes, for example, in Eugene, there's a lot of talk about localization. There was a list of, and part of it is, buy local, is quite a number of things we're probably all familiar with. And they had this list of businesses, small businesses, locally owned. It's all fine as far as that goes. Everything I was looking down the list, a whole bunch of them, everything in the stores is made in China. So, it's an illusion to talk about localization, relocalization, all that stuff. It's, you're just playing. You're not even beginning to look at the whole thing. Are we against globalization? These are the things that stand in the way of anybody's free choice, it seems to me. If you just accept it as given, and say once again, then, just wait for the terrible results. And the terrible results are really accelerating. I hate to sound like some gloomy prophet, but look around, and I assure you it's worse than the States. It comes to some of these places faster. That's a generalization, obviously, but the more development they have, the more awful it is. The more, on every level, pick one. It's really anyway.